Welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Roussel, and here is today's episode. So, Kwon and Gregory Thompson, welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So fun to have both of you together over this Zoom screen. You're both in the DC area, unless I'm mistaken, so we're almost neighbors-ish. And I would love to introduce you to our audience a little bit, for you to tell us a little bit about yourselves first.
Yeah, this is Duke speaking. I grew up in Southern California, and that's where I spent most of my younger years, and then moved to the East Coast for college. Was up in the Northeast for a number of years, and then moved down to DC for ministry, being a part of a network of church plants, new churches committed to inhabiting Washington, DC, not just DC as the federal capital, but as a series of local neighborhoods that we want to be faithful in, loving neighbor and loving God by God's grace. And so I've been doing that since 2004. So this is home. This is where all three of our kids have been born. And so we love being here and learning a lot ourselves, right? These are wild times to be in the nation's capital, but we're grateful for the calling to be faithful here.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is Gregory Thompson. I'm from South Carolina and grew up there, met my wife there. We went to seminary in St. Louis, and then moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, so just south of DC, a couple hours in 2000, where we've been. I was a pastor for a number of years, but also did graduate studies at the University of Virginia. I did my PhD on MLK while I was pastoring, and sort of lived at the intersection of a religious community, but also African-American cultural life for really 10 years in that context. And now my life continues to really live at that intersection as I'm involved in work more directly focused on race and repair in America.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. Before we get there, how did you guys meet?
Well, we've been in the same kind of circles. We were in the same Presbyterian, the same kind of circles, the same Presbyterian denomination for a number of years, and knew one another. But we really met, and I think started walking on this particular journey around race after the Charleston shootings in 2015. There was a gathering of church leaders, small gathering up in Washington, D.C., about how one would respond to such a terrible tragedy from within the context of the faith communities. And Duke and I were both sitting at that conference, learning together about that. And I think that is where we really began to see one another as, fellow sojourners on that road.
What led you to writing Reparations? I know you guys wrote it at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of all the last wave of racial upheavals, but how did the last few years in America lead you to write Reparations?
Well, I think the journey really started for me, and then Duke can tell his story when he rejoins us. But at those Charleston shootings, when I realized I need to give myself in a more devoted way to understanding and working in response to the kind of racial climate that could legitimate and sustain this kind of violence. And so I really began at that time to live and work more closely in African-American communities and to partner with other people on these matters of race. And during that time, what I noticed is that white Christians were often talking about race, and when they would talk about, to the extent that they talked about it as something that needed to be addressed, their primary lens was reconciliation, that we need to have relationships with one another. But then when I was working and talking to my Black colleagues and friends about this, the language they were using was reparations. Mm-hmm. And I realized that that not only was reparations not really talked about in white communities, when it was talked about, there was a highly allergic reaction. And so I began to think, somebody needs to bring these two communities together, because this is they're having separate conversations. I was living and working in Memphis at the time, around some issues of memorialization with MLK around the 50th anniversary of his assassination. I went to a conference in Nashville, I think, where Duke was speaking. We both were speaking at the conference, and I was sitting in the audience, and he gave a talk on reparations. And I'd already been thinking about this thing. How do we talk about this? And so I texted him from the floor while I was sitting there while he was talking, and said, "Hey, what would you think about writing a book on reparations together?" And we began that conversation, and we met with our editor at Brazos, and they gave the green light, and so we got after it.
What were you talking on specifically at that conference, Duke?
I was talking on reparations from a church perspective, and so some of the kernel of ideas that were developed more fully in the book. But that was a pleasure to sort of begin to sort of unveil or articulate some of the convictions that had been growing in my heart and my mind, especially in the course of ministry here in a city that's historically African American. So yeah, after giving that talk and talking with Greg, and I remember we met up in the green room afterwards and just started chatting a little bit. And there aren't many people in our ministry context that are, especially at that time, that were really thinking along these lines. And so just to find someone like-minded in that fashion in this brother Greg was a delight and an energizing thing. So that was the beginning of a lot of conversations around this.
So having read your book fully as a non-American, as a white non-American myself, I've learned a lot, even just from a historical perspective. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like you've written your book for, if I may, primarily white American Christians. And a lot of it is to educate the church about the history of America. I learned a ton of history that I didn't know. The history of slavery in America specifically. And then you were mentioning, Greg, how the word reparations comes across as maybe offensive in a lot of white Christians' ears, maybe less so now than a few years ago, I guess, but also like white supremacy. That's a really offending term. And yet you talk about it a lot and you unpack what it really means. And you really go to the root of the history of it all. So you really are very bold in your approach, but also incredibly educational. At least the first half of the book feels that way. Then you get much more into the practical, and you have very deep theology to go with it. So can you walk us a little bit about what you're trying to tell your audience about the history of slavery in America?
Sure. So I'll start. This is Greg. I mean, our basic sense was that precisely what you mentioned a moment ago, that a lot of people, for a whole series of complicated historical and personal reasons, don't know the stories about American history. They don't know the truth about this history, and it's easy for any nation to kind of wrap itself in these kind of gauzy myths of its own greatness, and not to actually reckon with the reality. And so our belief was, if we're gonna call people into the work of repair, we have to provide not only a moral case that has two parts to it. One is a historical dimension to it, and the other is a theological dimension to it. And so we just divided the book up really in that way. And so the idea was to help people understand, that racism in America was not just a personal problem or a relational problem or even a discrete institutional problem, that it was actually a cultural wide problem, that the nature of that cultural problem was the prejudicial supremacy of people deemed to be white. And the effect of that prejudice is the kind of inequitable distribution of the goods of the community along. And we basically say that means that white supremacy functions as a form of cultural theft. We then divide that up into three different types of theft: the theft of truth, which is through erasing things that we don't want to know, and also romanticizing things that we like to imagine. So romanticization and erasure. It's a theft of power. Obviously, the theft of bodily power, but also institutional power and political power, And you can see in America throughout its history the attempt to obstruct that kind of that power from African Americans, and then of wealth. Finally, not only through extracting wealth from Black labor, but also obstructing African American attempts to gather labor. And that really, these are basically incontestable historical realities. And the church has to live in light of those, because we're living in the consequences of those decisions. And so we tried to just make it as plain as we could. This is the missiological backdrop of our life as God's people in the United States. Are we going to live as if this is true, or are we not?
All right, so let me just backtrack for a second here, because I completely agree with you. But I have to say, the words white supremacy, for me being white, it feels wrong, because it's like, what have I done wrong kind of thing. So, your book does a masterful job of unpacking this. And so for anyone listening who feels offended, even by the words white supremacy, please, if you have any trust in Gospel Spice and in me, give this book a chance, because when you read it, you will discover what it really means, and you will not feel like it's a personal attack against you as an individual because you're white, but it's an honest look at American history and at the role that white power has played, and objectively absolutely fascinating. So is that all right to say that? Because I really feel
I think that's great. I mean, and keep in mind, your audience wouldn't know this, but I'm a white guy from South Carolina that's saying this. And I think it's important.
That's a question, because you're a white guy, Duke, you're Asian. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do a white and an Asian guy have to do with, helping on the dialogue on racial injustice and reparations?
Yeah, and we'd answer those differently because of our backgrounds. But just to speak to the white supremacy point briefly before Duke chimes in, I think one of the things that we're trying to say is white supremacy is not fundamentally a prejudicial disposition in the heart. Okay, mm-hmm. We're not saying that people in their own hearts always think of themselves de facto as either white or B as supreme, but it is a cultural reality that has institutional form and that does take shape in the psychology and in the decisions and in the relationships, and certainly in the aggregated benefits of this community. And that feels really important to acknowledge, especially since historically the people who are the architects of this social order explicitly use this language. Okay, so this is not just some quote Marxist invention that we're now inflicting upon everybody. This is what people themselves throughout American history have said, and rather than sanitizing that and pretending as though that's not true, as people of the truth, we want to just say it like we believe that it is.
Yeah, and I find it interesting because, again, me not being American, for me, your book is deeply rooted in American history. And mm-hmm. you talk about white supremacy in the context of American history. And I would venture to say that you're not saying that whites are supremacists everywhere in the world across time and space and history, but it's uniquely rooted in the American context. And coming with other examples of it in Europe, there would have been other types of some particular people groups being historically or culturally superior to others, not because they have superior worth, but because they are the conquerors. They are the winners of the game at any given mm-hmm. point. And that could be the Japanese over the Chinese, maybe a century ago or two. That could have been some African tribes over others in Africa, a while back. That could have been the Roman Empire or over the Slavic barbarians. And that's where the word slave comes from, right? From the Slavic northern barbarian tribes that weren't Roman, but that were conquered by the Romans. So it's just that notion is rooted in American history. And for me as a non-American, I think it's a very important historical piece of context. So I'm sorry, Duke, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's important to note that this is, yes, hard to talk about for a lot of people. And we labor, I think, in the book to be relatively empathetic about that. We acknowledge some of the challenges and difficulties. And I think especially Greg, writing as a white author, as a white Christian, was able to add a lot of that appropriate empathy, while also at the same time naming things as they truly are. And that is, again, to say that white supremacy is not a term that we are employing as a slur though it has been wrongly weaponized in a lot of contexts. And so we have to acknowledge that too. There's a reason why some people are sensitized or sensitive to it. But this is simply a historical reality. And again, in some contexts, both past and present, people actually evoke that phrase, name that phrase, use it with pride, and not just because they wear white hoods, but because there actually was sort of an intentional engineering and arrangement of the social order around advantaging those that are deemed white. And that's something we have to reckon with. It's a legacy that we continue to see the effects of to this present day. And in America, we tend to have a bad habit of wanting to talk about race and racism in a race neutral way. So in other words, sure, we can talk about the horrors of racism in the past, but we talk about it almost as if it was a natural disaster, right? So forces that are beyond us, terribly tragic. Let's help those that are victims of it. But there was no perpetrator that's identifiable, no one presently who's responsible, and no one who therefore, except out of spontaneous motivations of charity, must respond. No person or people group that is more responsible than any other. And we just believe that to be a fallacy, and felt like there's actually no way to rightly arrive at the Christian call to reparations without naming the white casting of the thefts that have occurred in our American past. And so that's why we felt it was not just a begrudging feature of our book to talk about white supremacy. We felt like it couldn't be rightly done without naming white supremacy for what it is.
Right. And you spend a lot of time really defining it. And I think that's what makes it really helps me understand it. Again, Greg, as you mentioned, the theft of truth, the theft of power, and the theft of wealth. And you spend a lot of time explaining what that looks like. And then you move to what you were saying, Duke, really the fact that truly only Christians are uniquely equipped to be a solution to this problem at a level that no one else can be. And so you move to the role of the church and a theological approach to reparations. So can you tell us about the failure of the church over the centuries and today, and then what can change?
Yeah, and let me qualify that what we don't want to communicate is that the Christian church is the only entity qualified to actually do the work of repair. In fact, the history of American repair is that Christians have often been a part of it, at times has even led that work, but certainly wasn't the exclusive participant in it. In fact, by God's grace, many other non-religious, non-believing people absolutely were crucial activists and advocates of repair. But what we do argue in the book is that the Christian church is singularly, uniquely responsible, partly because of its unique calling, our mission as a people of neighbor love, where we simply are in our very identity as Christians called to be people of repair, but also because of our unique history, and that is that we have been a crucial force in the thefts that have been perpetrated over the centuries. And again, that the church has often actively been perpetrators of theft, thieves ourselves as Christians, and at other times accomplices, aiding and abetting others who served as thieves. And by others, I mean both individuals as well as institutions, including the federal government. And all too often also negligent, silent bystanders who actually had power and responsibility to say something, to do something, and yet quietly went on their way. So that history includes the way in which American pulpits were employed using scripture to justify chattel slavery, the way in which the image of African-American image bearers was marred and trampled upon by Christians in a way where that legacy continues to that day, as Christians, even in that time, testified. This scourge of slavery would have been eradicated in that very day had Christians actually stood up righteously against the forces of the slave trade and slavery. So the church really bears a lot of responsibility. But I also want to say quickly too, that our case for the church's responsibility rests not only on the church's failure, but also its legacy of faithfulness. This isn't something that you actually hear much on these days, and that's because it is easy to sort of dance on the grave of the church's failures. There are many, and we need to reckon with those. But Christians in the past, and largely I'm referring to African-American Christians, have been faithful. And if we don't acknowledge that hope, then if we don't acknowledge that record of faithfulness, then we really don't have any hope in turning to the church today to be part of future repair. In other words, we have to acknowledge that the church continues to be the bride of Christ and the temple of the Holy Spirit that actually is invested with resources and spiritual power to do the work of repair. That actually is what should help us to sit up straight and rise up in a chastened way, of course, repentantly, of course, but with hope that Christ can still do the work of repair in and through our feeble means.
It was to me one of the most moving moments that in your book, as far as me learning history truly, was to hear from African American and white Christians way back when who were really fighting against slavery from the very beginning. They were the minority, but those voices existed, and I honestly did not know that. And it was good to know that. It was very hope-giving, truly.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and I think that really is part of the answer to the question of why a white guy and an Asian guy, taking up the question of reparations. I mean, this is the unfinished work of abolition and reconstruction that we believe is still happening. And so historically speaking, it's not at all idiosyncratic that a white person and an Asian person would take up the work of continuing to struggle for abolition and the reconstruction of America on grounds other than the supremacy of white people, the de facto supremacy of white people. Even if it's not an ideological commitment right now, it is a social fact.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of what we're continuing. And so we see ourselves, and I say this, in a non-grandiose way, but like this, there's a whole tradition in the American church of centering the neighbor, of saying this caste system is wicked. It's transparently wicked. Okay. It has all kinds of effects on people's minds, hearts, bodies, families, incomes, well-being broadly conceived. And we're just taking up the continued missionary work of resisting this and calling it, and calling for something more righteous in its place. And so, I mean, I obviously have my own autobiographical reasons why this matters to me as a Southern white man, a descendant of Klan members, who've lived. I mean, I'm again lived in South Carolina, have lived my whole life in the American South, and so I know this place. I love this place. I hate this place. It's this thing that you feel when you're a part of this, and so there's certainly an autobiographical reckoning. That's true of just me as a person, but as a Christian, there are, both in the African American church and in certain kinds of abolitionist movements around the country and throughout history, there's this whole stream of people who have seen this broken system for what it is, and in their own time have said, we need to say no to this, and we need to put something more beautiful in its place. And that's really the motivation for what we're doing.
mm-hmm.
And while we're on the topic of just stories and personal motivations and stuff, if I could comment briefly, since we've touched on it, about me being an Asian American in this conversation. I mean, as we talk about in the book, we do believe that one of the moral grounds for pursuing reparations is what we find in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is the call to neighbor love. And of course, that's a story of someone that comes across, the Samaritan who comes across a bloody victim on the ground who's been a victim of a robbery, of theft, and who proceeds to give up everything in order to restore that neighbor. And keeping in mind that Jesus creates this story as an embodiment and summary of what is called the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. He's expositing Leviticus 19 in story form. So this is a mandate that rests upon every one of our hearts and souls and lives. And the key thing about the Good Samaritan was he was an accidental neighbor, as it were. He came across this individual, and he had not actually had a history with this person. He did not actually perpetrate that theft himself.
Is that phone ringing? And yeah,
that is my bad.
Sorry, there's no way I can cut that out of the editing. Sorry about that. It stopped ringing right there, but can I have you get back the part where it's ringing? There's no way we can edit that out. And so can you go back? You were talking about Leviticus 19. Can you go back?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm causing all these troubles today.
Oh, no worries. Oh, all of those things and more. The things have happened.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I wanted to actually, my next question was about comparing Zacchaeus to the Good Samaritan in your second half. So go for it. Leviticus 19, right. The Good Samaritan, the questions that Jesus is asking indirectly, all in.
Yeah. So Jesus is expositing this part of Leviticus 19 and the call to neighbor love with this story. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the Samaritan was someone that had no past with this individual. He had no personal responsibility for this neighbor's wounds. He wasn't the perpetrator. He wasn't the robbers themselves. And yet he still loved simply because he loved. And in that same fashion, this is something that obviously works in my heart personally, where there's a lot to say about personal culpability or corporate guilt and so on and so forth, as in regards to one's responsibility to enact reparations. But there's also simply the call to neighbor love, regardless of whether or not you actually perpetrated the original theft yourself. And for me, that's meaningful because as an Asian American and the son of immigrants, my dad and mom came here in 1969, weren't here prior to that. And so certainly we can't pin any responsibility for the enslavement of people or even the Jim Crow atrocities that occurred. I'm motivated by neighbor love. I'm also motivated, however, by an understanding that almost every single one of us here in America are beneficiaries of the robberies that have occurred. And so even though, of course, it's neighbor love, but it's also a sense of responsibility that comes with knowing that just by being here in this country, we are continually benefiting from the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and so on and so forth. But then also simply as a member of the church, which is really the central part of our argument, that corporately speaking, the church itself is responsible for these things. And as long as I am not only a member of the church, but now a minister of Christ's church, that there's a unique responsibility that I bear. And so I know on the face of it, it seems like an oddity for an Asian American Christian to feel like it is my burden to bear. But I believe this wholeheartedly and unflinchingly, that this is something that I need to be a part of. And it's a joy to try to lead people into a similar kind of moral reasoning.
I can so echo this because I'm French. So I'm not even an American citizen. I've been living here for 6 or 7 years, and I can't say that my ancestors ever were slave owners or anything. But as you said, I'm part of the church, and being French, we have a very tight-knit history with the States, and D-Day saved Europe in World War II. And would America have been the strong superpower that it was in 45 had it not had all the economic success from
you know, the results of slavery, among other things. We don't know how history would have been different, but I think the entire world, at least the Western world, is by and large in a debt of gratitude to the US in terms of a superpower. And part of that superpower definitely comes from the effects of slavery, unfortunately. I think it's, so in some ways, we're all equally owners of responsibility in this. And in the same way, one of the things we do on Gospel Spice is raise awareness against sex trafficking. And the reason we do that, I say, is because I've never been a victim of it. And therefore, I have a debt to those that are. And because I have the blessing of never having been a victim of it, of actually not knowing anyone in my family or in my close friends who has been a victim of it, therefore, I have a greater debt to those that have been victims of it. And it's kind of your logic as well. And I very much appreciate that. So, and we do say, you know, love the Lord your God and then love your neighbor as yourself are the two things that we try to reconcile here. And when this rich Jewish man asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And that prompts the Good Samaritan story. He's asking, well, if that's my neighbor, then who isn't my neighbor? And Jesus's answer is, well, no one is not your neighbor. We're all neighbors to one another. So thank you for that. Can you tell us, because, okay, I've loved how you talk about the Good Samaritan and you contrast it somehow with the story of Zacchaeus. Do you want to tell us a bit about Zacchaeus and what his logic was in giving fourfold back and how that was rooted in Leviticus as well, and how the Good Samaritan actually is the more excellent way, as you say?
You want to go for that, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we the Zacchaeus story is really critical in part because this is a person who themselves was responsible and participatory in. And I mean, he had limited agency, right? I mean, he was under a power, a conquering or occupying power. And so it's not like he was the emperor of Rome, right? But he was participating in this system and a beneficiary of the system. And so he, based on that, you know, made restitution. But the Good Samaritan, as Duke said earlier, this is not a restitution situation. This is a restoration situation where you come upon this theft that has happened in which you were not directly implicated. And the moral response, however, is the same. It is the full restoration of the person to wholeness. And I think that seeing that different moral locations, one who is culpable and one who is not directly culpable, nonetheless, in the Christian moral logic of repair, lead to the same outcome, right? Both of them essentially saying, all that I have is yours. That feels like really important. And we did that both for biblical reasons, because we do think that, you know, the question of the book really is, what does the Bible say about theft? It's not like we're looking for reparations passages. It's just once we came to the conclusion that white supremacy was best understood as a cultural form of theft, then the next question was, what does the Bible and Christianity say about theft? Well, here are two really important theft stories. And so that's how we arrived at that. But it's also the case that we arrived at it because we anticipated people saying, well, I'm not directly culpable, therefore I'm not in any way obligated. And I frankly think that we've talked about this before, it's hard to conceive of a less orthodox Christian statement, given that our entire faith is predicated upon one who did not know sin becoming sin for someone else. And so you have to understand that the idea of responsibility without culpability is in fact embedded into the nature of the salvific system of the Christian faith. And so it makes sense to us that it would be extrapolated into the lives of God's people, that we ourselves would not begin with our own culpability, but we would begin by centering the neighbor, even the enemy, as a necessary recipient of our love. And so part of it, I think, really that some of the most disconcerting things that we've heard from Christians are the things like, I'm not responsible for this. Why should I pay for something I didn't do? These are the same people on Sundays that sing In Christ Alone. Okay. And so without being aware of the like profound moral incoherence of this position. And that feels really important to us.
You're saying, I think at some point you quote, I think it's Martin Luther King, correct me if I'm wrong, in saying that the role of Christians, and I'm very loosely paraphrasing here, is to go back to the Good Samaritan. It's not just to be a good Samaritan, though it is that, but it's also to clear the Jericho road of the robbers and then to create conditions so that robbery becomes impossible.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's his, yeah, that's his stuff. He says that in 68. You were gonna quote that, dude?
Yeah. It's one of his. He preached on the Good Samaritan a number of times, and yeah, one of his emphases there was the systemic conditions that led to the robbery in the first place that need to be addressed, and so it's a both and that's important too, so that we're not only thinking individualistically, which of course is the easiest way to short circuit the entire reparations conversation. Which is exactly why people have a hard time with the notion of white supremacy. It's have a hard time with the notion of the church bearing responsibility, having a hard time with the idea that they themselves might actually need to do something about this. It's all this individualistic thinking, whereas King certainly does apply this individually, personally, but also says, no, there are systemic conditions and issues that need to be addressed as well.
All right. So with you just saying this, I'm still going to ask the question, what is the Gospel Spice listener individually listening right now? What are they to do right now, having heard this? Besides, go and buy the book. Please, if you're listening to this, I beg you, go and read Reparations. That's the first thing you need to do. Because I think once you're done reading, you'll have some good ideas of what to do. But in a nutshell, what would you tell them to do?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is to understand that reparations is best enacted as a corporate endeavor. It's why we're talking to people not just as individuals, but as local churches and communities. We talk about the importance of following the leadership of African Americans in your local context. And so the more that this can actually stir up conversation within communities and in amongst relationships and in church settings, and Christian organizations and so on and so forth, I think is going to engender a healthier response, so that people aren't just running outside to their next door neighbor, handing over a 20 and saying, hey, here's my reparations, right? I mean, it doesn't exactly work that way. And it certainly falls apart as an offensive, even if well-intended sort of act. We want to call people into corporate endeavors, corporate action. But I also want to back up and say, appreciate you calling people to read the book. That's a very, very important first step, not just the book per se, but us investing time and energy into sort of discipling our moral sensibilities into the calling of repair. And what I mean by that is the church and most Christians in America, especially outside of the Black church context, are brand new to this idea. And we should not presume that just for having thought about it for 10 seconds that we're ready to go and do it. We really need to sit, pray, weep, repent, and grow into this with deeper soil, with deeper roots, before we can even dare suppose that we know what needs to be done. Again, lest we go out with the same paternalistic impulses that got us into this trouble in the first place, right? Let's not assume that we're already wise to these matters. I think we need to cultivate a deeper understanding. So that does mean, again, not just reading this book, but reading other histories, reading other theologies, understanding better what exactly this calling is, and then fostering that in community as we grow wise.
Yeah, and I would just add, thank you, Duke. I would say that it might be useful for your listeners to know that the book is really structured around three action points. The first is to see, and that means that some of the ways that our listeners can move towards the work of repair is just learning to see the realities of the history of this country, and frankly of I mean, this is true. It is a very American story, but America is one context of a broader kind of colonialist subset that where these kinds of dynamics were operating. But I think so really seeing, no matter where we are, seeing the history, What voices have been forsaken? Who has been promoted to the top of the social caste? On what grounds? What are the impacts of those things? A lot of us don't have to ask those questions if we don't want to. We can just live our lives and it's fine. But I think it's a moral act to be able to see the world as it is. The second structure is the own. That is to say, to take responsibility for those things which are ours, whether it's direct culpability or whether it's this this desire of calling, this reality of calling for the well-being of the neighbors. So seeing, owning, and then repairing is third. And when people start talking about repairing, what we urge in chapter 7 is to learn from African Americans who are actually working in this space and join yourselves to those work. Now, Duke and I are both doing that work in particular ways that we could talk about. I'm doing it, interestingly, in your hometown, but I mean, in your current town of Kennett Square. But I think I would really want to say to folks, this begins with seeing, and then it begins with taking moral responsibility for what you see. And then thirdly, it moves towards this work of constructive, informed, and creative action.
I love what you're saying because it makes me think of, so in the broader context of the series, Shades of Red, we talk about the various ways that we can, forgive me. We talk about the various ways that we can be part of the solution against human oppression in general. And we talk about 4 steps that we take. It's about first being informed, which is what you're saying, is get to know what's really happening and move away from the myth and truly get informed. And your book does that beautifully. And then to intercede is the second step, is to pray for those people that you're hoping to serve and to love on and to be your neighbor. So interceding for them and then and for yourself, in my experience. Before you launch into any kind of work, which is what we call involvement. So then it's getting involved, most likely at a local level of some sort, whether it's a halfway house in sex trafficking or in conversations with your African-American neighbors or whatever the case may be. And then the fourth step is to be a force for influence, which is sharing what you're learning and inviting others into that circle of neighborly love. So it sounds very similar. I love that it's the same philosophy, really, which makes sense because it's probably from the Bible. What do you think?
That sounds right.
Some of this really, I think, is an attempt to acknowledge that what we're really trying to do is to shape people's moral imagination around these issues. And that is to say that the way that we understand reparations is simply an undoing of the thefts that have been historically perpetrated. So if the work is to reverse engineer or to undo, then you have to know how the theft occurred in the first place. And so in other words, there's just a wide range of possibilities for how people can engage this work if you can actually start to see all the myriad ways in which the African American community has been robbed in the first place. And there are countless ways in which that has occurred. And so if we just begin to apply this framework of understanding racism, white supremacy, not just as hurt feelings and not just as broken relationships, but as white supremacy, whose essence and primary social effect is that of theft, and that theft has occurred in at least 3 dimensions: the theft of truth, theft of power, and the theft of wealth. Now we have a different moral grid with which we can just look out into the world in whatever sort of vocational spheres that God by his providence has drawn us into. And we can just start asking questions. What do we see? And how does this particular thing need to be repaired? Now that takes time and that takes maturity or maturing into, but I think that's really what we're calling people to. It ends up then being a creative work and not just a prescriptive work. Here are the 3 things you need to do, which I think is what some of us, maybe it's a uniquely American impulse. We've heard that response often from our readers. Well, you should have told us more of what to do. But our intention from the beginning was not to give a blueprint, but rather to fire up an imagination that actually could creatively in local communities, according to the needs that one learns to see themselves and in their communities, that can be creatively applied. And that would be a joy to see for people to chase after it in different sorts of ways.
It's about being brave enough to dare to step away from what scares us in order to consider the potential for creating beauty out of all that destruction and that chaos.
That's right.
That
And
requires
that's
true
right.
courage. And that's why I was saying at the beginning that I think, and I'm glad you stated clearly that a lot of non-Christians have done tremendous work towards this work of recognition and of reparation. But I think in Christ, we are uniquely equipped to see the potential for beauty out of chaos, because God knows He is bringing beauty out of my chaos, and I really need Him. And therefore, He teaches us to be that force in the world as well. So
That's right.
thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and I think the idea is that and we want just the readers to and listeners who struggle with this to take some consolation in the fact that this is less formulaic and more improvisational and collaborative and creative, and that there's a lot of freedom in that, because people, I think, are afraid to make mistakes. Well, just tell us what we're supposed to do. And I'm like, no, the living God is within you. Okay, listen to your neighbors. Imagine a new world. Imagine a world in which the consequences of this horrible caste system are slowly done away with. What would that world look like? Now let's just go build that. And I think that that's part of the creative task. And the formulaic approach actually only diminishes the imagination. Frankly, what we need to do is just open ourselves to these realities and see what happens.
Being married to an African husband, there's a lot of beauty out of cross-cultural, relationships. And so the beauty of every tongue and tribe and nation worshiping the Lord together, that is something we can learn to practice. We can practice for heaven here on earth through this.
That's right.
All right. It's a little after 4. I want to be mindful of your time. Is there anything else that you would want to add? Is there a question you'd like me to ask you to wrap things up? Or something?
No, nothing immediately comes to my mind.
All right.
I think you covered a lot of good stuff.
I think all I would want, I would want us to be able to say clearly, and maybe I'll just say it here, and if you want to reframe it, we can, that we believe that this work, given the cultural and historical realities of American history, and given the profound consequences for people's minds, hearts, bodies, relationships, wealth, etc., that this is one of the central missiological challenges facing the Christian church in North America and in the United States. And this is not something in our judgment that you can just kind of farm out to sort of racial justice person in your church, the person who thinks about social justice as one of the like 40 things that you care about. This is in our view, the fundamental backdrop against which American society has developed. And so we have to really want to urge church leaders to say, this is not just for the like racially interested person in your congregation. The missiological integrity of the Church of Jesus in the United States is, in our view, directly related to our willingness to tell the truth about these things and to take constructive, self-sacrificial, collaborative, and creative initiative to say, finally, no to a system, to a social order that is predicated on and reflective of a racial hierarchy. We need to be able to say no to that. And unless we can say no to that, the church loses its credibility in really powerful ways. But if we say yes to it, then I think we're moving towards being the people of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, Greg.
Has echoes of the fight that the German church had in the 1930s and 40s, and how they failed, by and large, Dietrich Bonhoeffer excluded, in raising the flag against what it means to be a Christian in a society that does not treat everyone equally. So maybe not that extreme, but there's enough.
Yeah, that extreme. That was Hitler's reign was 12 years. Okay. Yep. And so yeah, that's the thing. This has the impression of being less extreme because it's been a slow boil over multiple centuries, but the catastrophe wrought is enormous. And I think every bit at the scale of what we're facing in the 12-year reign of the Reich.
All right.
No, that's
or
right.
the 45-year reign of apartheid.
And even what you're saying, Greg, about missional integrity, it's absolutely true that if we measure sort of the intensity and the urgency of the church's various callings, this one is certainly driven by the degree of historical neglect, right? As far as what the church has refused to address over centuries. And again and again at every generation, which is part of what we try to convey in some of the middle chapters there of the book, that this isn't just us anachronistically looking back at history and saying, oh, it's all about race, as some people accuse us of doing, but faithful Christians in every generation loudly testified to the church's neglect and its total dereliction of duty as far as its calling to address these matters and to be healers, as we're called to heal. We have dropped that ball and we have failed at every point. That urgency has risen now to the point where it is our primary calling to address these things.
Yep. I truly feel that our generation is called to be a true force to change all forms of human oppression, of which, again, I believe that racism and sex trafficking are two of the primary forms, if not the only one. They're not the only ones, but they're two of the primary ones. And I'm convinced our generation has a unique role. And I feel our role here at Gospel Spice at a very small scale is to raise awareness, and yours is to educate and to provide practical solutions. And so I'm extremely grateful. Again, I have read a lot of books on history in America through the lens of racism as I'm becoming educated over the last few years, and yours truly stands out. And that's why I really wanted to have you on the show to share you with our audience, because as you're listening to this, if there is one book to read, honestly, from my humble, limited perspective, I would say go and grab Reparations. It will enlighten you about what's been going on. So Kwon and Greg Thompson, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been delightful and hard to read your stuff, and but in a very good way. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Have you ever considered that Stephanie is available to speak to your group or at your event? She's currently booking speaking engagements both in person and virtual for the next 12 to 24 months. Stephanie speaks on a variety of topics, from scripture study to seasonal events and so much more. You can even book the Gospel Spice team to provide a more in-depth conference experience. If you follow Gospel Spice, then you know our desire is to inspire everyone to taste and see the wonderful spices that the gospel has to offer. Go to gospelspice.com/speaking for details.
Now, back to the video.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the Gospel Spice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of Gospel Spice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.